The rubble of post-war Britain gave rise to shadows on the screen. Amid ration books and bombed-out streets, filmmakers whispered stories of crime, betrayal, and survival. Some became classics. Others, equally daring, faded into silence. What happened to these gritty gems? Tonight, we unearth 15 forgotten British crime films of the 1950s, where the underworld met uneasy post-war dreams. 15. The Blue Lamp, 1950. At the dawn of the 1950s, The Blue Lamp was more than a film. It was a mirror to Britain's uneasy return to civilian life. Once hailed as a defining police drama, it blended documentary realism with a tense, emotional story of crime. Audiences gasped when beloved actor Jack Warner's character, P.C. George Dixon, was gunned down on duty. But here's the irony. Though Dixon's on-screen death shocked viewers, the public mourned so deeply that the BBC later resurrected him in the iconic series Dixon of Dock Green, making Warner the very symbol of post-war policing. Yet the film itself became overshadowed by the TV show it inspired. Behind the scenes, director Basil Dearden deliberately portrayed youth crime with uncomfortable honesty, at a time when newspapers warned of spivs and restless post-war delinquents. Dirk Bogarde, playing the brooding young criminal, found his career catapulted by the role. But the gritty story was eventually softened in public memory, eclipsed by Warner's avuncular Dixon persona on television. Today, The Blue Lamp is remembered only faintly, a film that launched a cultural icon but quietly slipped from Britain's cinematic canon. Its true legacy lies in its bravery, portraying the post-war streets not as noble, but as uncertain battlegrounds where law, loss, and memory collided. 14. Pool of London, 1951. A film drenched in shadows and fog, Pool of London was remarkable for being one of the first British films to explore an interracial romance, at a time when such stories were rarely acknowledged on screen. Starring Earl Cameron and Bonner Coliano, it set its tale against the murky docks of post-war London, where smuggling, theft, and betrayal lurked at every turn. The movie was daring. Critics praised its noir-like cinematography, which captured London's riverfront as both glamorous and decayed. But it was Cameron's presence, playing a Jamaican sailor caught in a romance with a white woman, that made it quietly revolutionary. The romance was subtle, coded, and never openly acknowledged, but audiences recognized the daring undercurrent. Why, then, is this film forgotten? Perhaps because Britain, still reckoning with its empire and the arrival of Caribbean immigrants, was not ready to celebrate such a story. Its boldness was quietly buried, and Cameron himself admitted years later that though the film was groundbreaking, its legacy was denied the spotlight it deserved. Pool of London remains a time capsule of a city in flux, haunted docks, flickering lights, and lives caught. Between loyalty and lawlessness, its daring social commentary lies hidden beneath its crime thriller surface, waiting to be rediscovered. 13. The Long Memory, 1953. John Mills, a name synonymous with British heroism, took a surprising turn in The Long Memory. Here he played a man released from prison after serving time for a crime he did not commit. What followed was not triumph, but a slow, brooding descent into obsession and revenge. The film was praised for its moody, almost expressionistic visuals, filmed among the desolate marshes of the Thames estuary. Those haunting landscapes mirrored Britain's lingering scars, ruined spaces, half-rebuilt lives, and the bitterness of injustice. Critics admired its bold atmosphere, but audiences, still craving optimism in post-war recovery, turned away from such grimness. Behind the camera, director Robert Hamer, already struggling with personal demons, crafted one of his darkest works. His career would falter soon after, plagued by ill health and personal turmoil, and this film slipped into obscurity alongside him. Yet The Long Memory deserves remembrance. It is less about crime than about the cost of suspicion, the way a single injustice can hollow out a man's spirit. Mills, stripped of his usual charm, delivered a raw, unsettling performance that critics now recognize as one of his most daring. Forgotten by many, the long memory lingers like a ghost, an echo of Britain's weary conscience in the shadow of war. 12. The Yellow Balloon, 1953. When The Yellow Balloon premiered, critics called it a grim fairy tale for post-war Britain. At first glance, it looked almost innocent, a boy, a balloon, and the crowded streets of London. But this was no children's story. Instead, it became one of the most chilling depictions of how ordinary lives could be pulled into the darkness of crime. The film begins with a child's accident that spirals into tragedy. A young boy, terrified of being blamed, falls into the orbit of a ruthless criminal played by the menacing William Sylvester. What follows is a tense game of manipulation where innocence is gradually corrupted and the gray streets of London become a stage for moral collapse. Director J. Lee Thompson, who would later earn acclaim for Cape Fear, used expressionistic cinematography to turn bomb-damaged ruins into a visual metaphor for broken childhoods. He insisted on filming on location in the East End, giving the story a raw documentary feel. For audiences in the early 1950s, still recovering from wartime trauma, it was almost too real. Though praised at the time for its intensity, The Yellow Balloon soon faded. Some critics felt it was too disturbing for mainstream audiences, while others dismissed it as overly bleak. Unlike lighter crime capers that flourished later in the decade, this film offered no comforting escape. Today, it stands as a forgotten masterpiece of psychological crime drama, one that dared to show that danger wasn't only found in smoky pubs or dockside gangs, but in the fragile choices of everyday life. The Yellow Balloon lingers like a childhood nightmare you can't quite shake. 11. Cast a Dark Shadow, 1955. Few films of the era dared to show crime not as a desperate act of survival, but as cold-blooded ambition. Cast a Dark Shadow is one of those rare exceptions. Dirk Bogarde, already known for his brooding roles, delivered one of his most sinister performances as a man who marries wealthy older women, then dispatches them for their money. Audiences in 1955 were unprepared for the film's mix of gothic melodrama and cynical crime story. Bogarde's character, Teddy Bear, was charming on the surface but utterly hollow underneath. Margaret Lockwood, in one of her final major film roles, gave the story its counterbalance as a suspicious widow who might outwit him. The result was a psychological duel charged with tension and menace. Behind the camera, director Lewis Gilbert, who would later helm James Bond epics like You Only Live Twice, crafted something more intimate here. His focus was claustrophobic interiors, whispered threats, and the way greed poisons every relationship it touches. The press, however, didn't know what to make of it. Too dark for mainstream crime audiences, too pulpish for critics, the film slipped into obscurity. For Bogarde, the role foreshadowed his later career choices, where he rejected matinee idol parts in favor of complex, often unsettling characters. But in the mid-1950s, audiences preferred him as a romantic lead. Cast a Dark Shadow was largely forgotten, overshadowed by lighter British thrillers of the decade. Looking back, the film feels like a chilling parable of post-war disillusionment. In an era rebuilding itself on promises of prosperity, Cast a Dark Shadow whispered that ambition could just as easily destroy as build. 10. The Good Die Young, 1954. By the mid-1950s, Britain's crime cinema began flirting with ensemble storytelling, and The Good Die Young was its most daring experiment. With a cast that included Lawrence Harvey, Gloria Graham, Stanley Baker, and even Hollywood's own Richard Basehart, the film promised glamour. What it delivered instead was tragedy. The story followed four men from different backgrounds: a disillusioned boxer, a war veteran, a bitter clerk, and an American trapped in personal despair. Each was broken in his own way, and together they were drawn into a robbery that seemed like a solution. The heist, of course, unraveled. And so did they. Critics at the time admired the performances, but were unsettled by the unrelenting cynicism. This was no Robin Hood-style caper, nor a glamorous gangster saga. Instead, The Good Die Young declared that post-war Britain was full of lost men, heroes of yesterday, now invisible casualties of peacetime. Behind the scenes, director Lewis Gilbert again showed his knack for tension, shooting the robbery sequence with stark precision. But it was the emotional build-up that made the film memorable, watching men destroyed not by bullets, but by disappointment, bad luck, and desperation. Despite its star-studded cast, the film struggled at the box office. Perhaps it was too bleak, too fatalistic, for audiences hoping for escapism. Today, however, it resonates as one of the most honest depictions of fractured masculinity in post-war Britain. In the end, The Good Die Young isn't just a forgotten film. It's a forgotten eulogy for an entire generation of men who returned from war only to find peace more brutal than battle. 9. Tiger Bay, 1959. When Tiger Bay premiered, audiences expected another tidy British crime thriller. What they got was something altogether different, a story told through the eyes of a child tangled in adult violence. This was the film that introduced the world to a young Hayley Mills, who played a mischievous girl in Cardiff's Docklands, accidentally witnessing a crime of passion. At the heart of the story was Horst Buchholz as a Polish sailor who kills his lover during a quarrel. Instead of painting him as a clear-cut villain, the film did something daring. It humanized him. Through the bond he forms with Mills' character, audiences were forced to wrestle with empathy and moral grayness. It was a risky move in an era that often preferred neat justice. Behind the camera, director J. Lee Thompson again proved fearless, using Cardiff's gritty docks and immigrant communities as a living backdrop. He insisted on shooting on location, capturing the energy of a city still rebuilding from war. It wasn't just a crime film, it was a social document filled with the rhythms of working-class Britain. Critics praised Mills's precocious performance, and Buchholz became an international star. Yet strangely, Tiger Bay slipped from cultural memory, overshadowed by the massive success of Pollyanna, 1960, which made Hayley Mills a Disney household name. In Britain's crime canon, it became an afterthought. Today, the film feels ahead of its time, an exploration of crime, morality, and immigration through the unflinching eyes of a child. Tiger Bay whispers of innocence lost not through fantasy, but through the quiet brutality of reality. 8. Hell Drivers, 1957. For sheer adrenaline, Hell Drivers was unlike anything else in British cinema. This wasn't a film about gangsters in smoky rooms. It was about men driving trucks at deadly speeds down rural roads, caught in a cycle of danger, corruption, and machismo. Stanley Baker played Tom Yateley, an ex-convict trying to rebuild his life as a haulage driver. But he soon discovers that the trucking company is rotten at its core, where drivers are forced into dangerous races and pushed to exhaustion for profit. The film's action sequences, trucks skidding on dirt roads, engines roaring, lives dangling on the edge, felt raw and visceral years before car chases became staples of Hollywood cinema. The cast was remarkable. Alongside Baker were a young Sean Connery, Herbert Lom, and Patrick McGoohan, all simmering with intensity. McGoohan, especially, delivered one of the nastiest villains of the decade, a sadistic foreman who thrived on exploiting desperate men. Despite its energy, Hell Drivers never became the cultural landmark it deserved. Perhaps its setting, truck yards and rural highways, felt too ordinary to capture long-term fascination. Or perhaps its bleak message about exploitation clashed with Britain's mid-century optimism. Yet the film deserves rediscovery. It is a furious critique of labor abuse, a howl of anger against a system that chews up working men and spits them out. In Hell Drivers, crime isn't committed in shadows. It's embedded in the very structure of work itself. 7. They Made Me a Fugitive, 1950. One of the earliest post-war crime noirs, They Made Me a Fugitive set the tone for the entire decade. Starring Trevor Howard, it told the story of a disillusioned ex-serviceman who becomes entangled with a ruthless smuggling gang. Betrayed and framed, he goes on the run, hunted by both criminals and police. Audiences at the time recognized the bitterness in Howard's performance. Here was no heroic veteran, just a man chewed up by war and spit out into a world that offered him little. The film's tone was fatalistic, almost European in its nihilism, which wasn't surprising since its director, Alberto Cavalcanti, came from Brazil by way of French cinema. The locations were striking: rain-slick streets, bombed-out buildings, and claustrophobic hideouts. Everything about the film screamed of a Britain that hadn't healed, a society still scarred and suspicious. Critics admired its artistry, but general audiences found it too bleak, and it was soon overshadowed by more glamorous American noirs. Cavalcanti himself never fully broke through in Britain again. His outsider perspective, once celebrated, became quietly marginalized. And so They Made Me a Fugitive faded into the background, remembered only by cinephiles. But its message lingers, that sometimes the greatest crime is how society abandons those who fought for it. The title itself reads like an accusation. 3. The Man Who Never Was, 1956. Some crime films are fictional. Others are drawn from history. The Man Who Never Was blurred the line, dramatizing one of the most audacious deceptions of World War II, Operation Mincemeat. At first glance, it wasn't a crime film in the traditional sense. But at its core, it was about forgery, manipulation, and the use of a dead man as a weapon of war. Clifton Webb starred as Ewan Montague, the intelligence officer behind the plot to trick the Nazis into believing that Allied forces would invade Greece rather than Sicily. The crime was macabre: a corpse dressed as a Royal Marine officer, planted with false documents, and set adrift off the coast of Spain. The Germans took the bait. Thousands of lives were saved. Though it was based on true events, the film used the structure of a crime thriller: careful planning, suspense, the risk of exposure. Webb, usually cast as urbane or icy characters, brought gravitas to Montague. Yet despite the story's real-world impact, the film never achieved the cultural immortality of other wartime dramas. Why? Perhaps because Britain, still emerging from post-war austerity, preferred tales of courage over stories that exposed the morbid pragmatism of espionage. The Man Who Never Was slipped into history's margins, overshadowed by louder war epics. Today, it remains a haunting reminder. Sometimes the most decisive crimes are committed not for greed or revenge, but in the shadows of survival. 2. The Small Back Room, 1949, released widely in the 1950s. Though technically a late 1940s production, The Small Back Room found its audience in the early 1950s and deserves its place here. Directed by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, the duo behind The Red Shoes and Black Narcissus, this was their darkest work. A psychological thriller cloaked as a crime film, it examined the war after the war, the private battles of men broken by duty. David Farrar starred as Sammy Rice, a bomb disposal expert battling alcoholism and self-loathing. The film's central sequence, Sammy alone, sweating, trying to defuse a German booby-trapped bomb, is one of the tensest in British cinema. It is as much about his fractured psyche as it is about the physical danger. Unlike Powell and Pressburger's lush Technicolor masterpieces, this film was shot in grim black and white. Shadows swallowed the characters, offices felt claustrophobic, and even domestic interiors carried an oppressive weight. It was a crime film in disguise, not about thieves or killers, but about the crime of war's lingering damage on the human spirit. Audiences didn't embrace it. Too slow, too dark, too psychologically heavy. It vanished beneath the brightness of post-war optimism. Yet today, it feels startlingly modern. Addiction, trauma, and self-destruction, these are not distant relics, but ongoing battles. The Small Back Room is not just forgotten. It is buried treasure, waiting for those willing to confront its bleak brilliance. 1. Odd Man Out, 1947, revived through the 1950s. The greatest forgotten British post-war crime film didn't just fade from memory, it became overshadowed by its own reputation. Carol Reed's Odd Man Out, starring James Mason as an Irish nationalist on the run after a failed robbery, was hailed as a masterpiece on release. Graham Greene called it one of the best films ever made, yet as Reed went on to direct The Third Man, Odd Man Out began to vanish from public conversation, its brilliance eclipsed by Reed's later triumph. But in truth, Odd Man Out is the purer, more haunting film. Mason's performance as Johnny McQueen, bleeding and delirious as he stumbles through Belfast's night, is staggering. Each person he encounters, priests, lovers, criminals, strangers, reflects a fragment of humanity: greed, compassion, betrayal, mercy. The city itself becomes a labyrinth, swallowing him whole. Visually, the film foreshadowed European cinema's existentialism. The chiaroscuro lighting, the surreal touches as Johnny's vision blurs, the slow inevitability of his fate, all pushed British crime cinema into art. Yet because it straddled the line between political thriller and allegory, it never secured a permanent place in mainstream culture. Forgotten by audiences but revered by filmmakers, Odd Man Out remains a towering work of noir tragedy. Its message endures that the greatest crime is not always robbery or murder, but the futility of running from fate itself. In the ruins of post-war Britain, crime cinema became a mirror, sometimes bleak, sometimes daring, always human. These 15 films, once forgotten, remind us that history lives not only in victories but in shadows. Which of these would you revive for today's audiences? Like, subscribe, and share your pick below.